Can a police officer force you to show him your guns? The answer depends heavily on where that officer is standing when he asks. Today, we're going to break this down into 3 situations you could actually find yourself in: a federal agent knocking on your front door, a police officer during a routine traffic stop, and a situation a lot of people forget about entirely, which is when officers show up at your workplace or approach you while you're simply out in public, open carrying, or visibly armed. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what to say, what not to say, and exactly what your rights are in each one of these scenarios. So stick around, because tip number 3 is the one most gun owners have never even thought about. Let's start with tip number 1, and that is what to do if a federal agent or a police officer shows up at your front door asking about your firearms. This happens more than people realize. Sometimes it's a local detective doing what's called a knock and talk. And sometimes it's a federal agent from the ATF who has pulled purchase records and wants to confirm that you still physically possess a weapon you bought. It sounds intrusive because it is intrusive, but here's what you need to understand. Your home carries the highest level of constitutional protection under the 4th Amendment that exists anywhere in the law. It does not matter if the firearm in question is a basic handgun, a hunting rifle, or something regulated more heavily like a short-barreled rifle, a suppressor, or another item that falls under stricter federal licensing. None of that paperwork, none of those applications, and none of those background checks ever required you to waive your constitutional right to be free from an unreasonable search. Owning a firearm, even a heavily regulated one, is not a legal loophole that allows the government to walk into your home whenever it wants to check on you. So if that knock comes and an agent says he needs to see the guns, you do not have to open the door at all. You do not have to answer through the door. You do not have to acknowledge that you are even home. The only ways an officer or agent can lawfully force entry into your home are if you voluntarily give consent, if they have a valid search warrant signed by a judge based on probable cause, if they have a valid arrest warrant for you specifically, or if there are true emergency circumstances, meaning they have an objective reason to believe evidence is being destroyed or a crime is actively occurring inside. Outside of those 4 situations, nothing they say at your door changes your rights. And here is something important that a lot of people miss. The moment you open that door and start talking, you are giving that officer a window into your home. Anything he can see from that vantage point, under what's called the plain view doctrine, can potentially be used to build probable cause for a much broader search. So the smartest move, if you choose to engage at all, is to speak through a closed door, or open it only enough to state clearly that you do not consent to any search and that you are exercising your right to remain silent. If they do have a valid warrant, you are entitled to see it, and you can ask that it be slid underneath the door or held up to a window before you open anything. Once you've confirmed it's legitimate, you can let them in, but even then you do not have to answer questions. You can simply say that you are exercising your right to remain silent and that you do not consent to any search of anything beyond what is specifically named in that warrant, and then stay quiet. One caveat worth mentioning: if you happen to fall into a legally prohibited category, for example, a prior felony conviction or a domestic violence conviction that legally bars firearm possession, that changes the underlying legality of owning the weapon itself, but it does not strip away your right to refuse entry or refuse to answer questions. You still do not have to let anyone inside just because they showed up asking. Now let's move to tip number 2, which covers the situation people encounter far more often, and that is a traffic stop. You get pulled over, maybe for speeding, maybe for a broken taillight, and at some point, the officer asks whether you have any weapons in the vehicle or flatly tells you to hand them over. The first thing to understand is basic scene management, because how you physically behave in the first 30 seconds of that stop shapes everything that happens afterward. Keep both hands visible on the steering wheel. Do not reach into the glove box, under the seat, or into a bag until the officer directly instructs you to and you've told him out loud exactly what you're doing and where you're reaching. Officers are trained to interpret sudden or unexplained movements as what's legally described as furtive movement. And that single observation is one of the easiest ways for an officer to justify expanding the stop into a full search under the umbrella of officer safety. Stay calm, stay polite, and hand over your license, registration, and insurance when asked. Being cooperative on these basic procedural points costs you nothing. and it removes any legitimate excuse the officer might otherwise have to escalate the encounter. Where people get into trouble is when the questions shift from routine to investigative. An officer might casually ask, "So you don't have any guns in here, right?" in a tone designed to make silence feel suspicious or make an honest answer feel like an admission of guilt. You are under no obligation to answer questions about weapons, contraband, where you're headed, or anything else beyond what your state specifically requires you to provide, which is typically limited to identifying documents. You can say respectfully, "Officer, I am exercising my right to remain silent," and continue to comply physically without volunteering information verbally. This matters just as much with firearms as with anything else an officer might be probing for. A traffic stop for speeding does not automatically give an officer legal authority to search your car or demand you hand over a weapon. That authority typically only exists if you consent, if there's probable cause of an actual crime, or if the officer can point to specific objective facts that placed him in genuine fear for his safety, not just a hunch. If the officer asks to search your vehicle, you have every right to say clearly, "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." And that single sentence, spoken once and calmly, is often the most important thing you say during the entire stop. Silence alone is not always enough, because some courts have allowed officers to argue that silence implied consent, so you want to make the refusal explicit and verbal. If the officer orders you out of the vehicle, comply with that instruction, since resisting a lawful order to exit is a separate legal problem entirely and one you do not want to create for yourself. But complying with the order to step outside is not the same as consenting to a search, and you can restate your refusal to consent even while standing outside the car. If at any point you're unsure whether you're being detained or free to leave, you can directly ask the officer, "Am I free to go?" If he says no, that confirms you are being detained, and at that point it becomes important to also state that you are invoking your right to an attorney, because officers are not always required to read you your Miranda rights unless and until they begin a custodial interrogation, and asking for a lawyer up front closes that door before it opens. Now for tip number 3, the one most people never think about until it happens to them, and that involves being approached in public while visibly armed, whether that's open carry or being approached by a private employer or a store representative asking to see a concealed weapon. Depending on your state, open carry is either fully legal, legal with certain restrictions, or restricted heavily. And the laws vary enormously from one state to the next, so knowing your specific state's firearm statutes before you ever leave the house is not optional, it's essential. If you are lawfully open carrying and an officer approaches simply because someone called in a report of a man with a gun, that officer is generally allowed to conduct a brief investigatory stop to confirm you are legally permitted to carry that weapon, but a brief identity check is not the same as a full search, and it is not the same as a demand that you hand over the firearm itself unless the officer has independent reasonable suspicion that a crime is occurring or that you are otherwise prohibited from possessing it. You are allowed to keep your hands away from the weapon, keep them visible, and calmly identify yourself if your state requires it, without volunteering additional statements about why you're carrying, where you got the weapon, or anything else. And if you are stopped by private security or a store employee rather than a sworn officer, understand that private individuals generally cannot search you or seize your property without your consent, though a business does have the right to ask you to leave the premises, and refusing to leave at that point can become a trespassing issue separate from anything involving the firearm itself. Across every one of these 3 situations, the theme is exactly the same. You have a constitutional right to remain silent. You have a constitutional right to refuse consent to a search, and simply exercising those rights calmly and clearly can never legally be used against you in court as evidence of guilt. The mistake I see over and over again is people trying to talk their way out of a situation, thinking that cooperation and friendliness in conversation will make the encounter end faster, when in reality it almost always does the opposite. Officers are trained interviewers. They know how to ask questions in a way that makes silence feel awkward and makes talking feel like the easier path. It rarely is. The safest, most legally sound path in every one of these situations is the same. Stay calm, stay polite, comply with lawful physical instructions like stepping out of a vehicle, but verbally and clearly assert that you are exercising your right to remain silent and that you do not consent to any search. And if you are being detained, that you are invoking your right to speak with an attorney. Do that consistently, and you put yourself in the strongest possible legal position, no matter which one of these scenarios you find yourself in. If this video helped clarify your rights, make sure you're subscribed because we cover real situations like this every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.